Coffee spilled on a $12,000 suit doesn't just stain, it physically burns. Evelyn didn't care about the heat radiating against her ribs, only the 90-second delay it would cause. She ran a multinational equity firm with the precision of a scalpel, treating human error as a personal insult. When a guy in a faded flannel shirt, balancing a sticky-fingered toddler and a bulging diaper bag blocked the doors to her private elevator, she scoffed. "Move!" she snapped. He didn't blink. He just shifted the kid on his hip and said, "Actually, I think you're in my building." Evelyn tasted copper. It was a phantom flavor that always coated her tongue when she hadn't slept in 3 days. The air inside the monolithic lobby of Apex Holdings was filtered 3 times before it reached human lungs, leaving it smelling of absolutely nothing. No dust, no ozone. Just the chilled, sterile vacuum of corporate power. Her heels clicked against the Brazilian quartzite floor, a sharp, metronomic rhythm that usually scattered interns and junior executives like roaches under a halogen bulb. Today was the merger. Her merger. She had gutted 3 mid-sized tech firms, sold off their useless hardware divisions, and bundled their IP into a neat billion-dollar package that was going public at 10 o'clock. She pressed the biometric pad for the executive elevator. The red scanner blinked green. The steel doors, polished to a mirror finish, slid open with a muted hum. "Hold that, please." The voice wasn't a corporate bark or a deferential plea. It was flat, exhausted. Evelyn turned her thumb instinctively, rubbing the smooth bezel of her Patek Philippe watch. A man was jogging awkwardly toward her. He wore a navy canvas jacket that had seen too many washing cycles, the collar permanently curled. In his left arm he carried a little girl who looked to be about 3, her face buried in his shoulder, asleep. Her tiny hand, coated in what looked like dried syrup, dangled perilously close to the pristine fabric of his shirt. In his right hand, he clutched a battered manila envelope and a plastic sippy cup shaped like a cartoon dog. He smelled of damp wool, cheap dark roast coffee, and artificial strawberry. It was an assault on the lobby's engineered nothingness. "Service elevators are around the back past the loading dock," Evelyn said. Her voice was perfectly modulated. She didn't sound angry. She sounded like a machine stating a fact. She stepped inside the cab and reached for the close doors button. The man stuck a scuffed work boot directly into the path of the closing doors. The heavy steel shuddered sensors protesting before sliding back open. Evelyn felt a twitch under her left eye. "Security," she said, raising her voice just enough to carry to the front desk. "They already checked my ID," the man said, breathing heavily. He stepped into the elevator. The space immediately felt claustrophobic. The little girl stirred, making a soft, wet, smacking sound with her lips. The man rubbed her back with a calloused hand. "Sorry, bus was late. Then she threw up on my jacket, so I had to buy this one at a thrift store down the block." Evelyn stared at him. Not at his face, but at the frayed thread hanging from his sleeve. "I don't care about your transit issues. This is a private elevator for executive staff and board members. Get out." He leaned against the handrail, looking utterly unbothered by her venom. He had dark circles under his eyes, the kind that looked bruised into the skin. "I'm going to the 82nd floor. The boardroom." Evelyn let out a short, sharp laugh. It lacked humor, sounding more like coughing up a splinter. "Are you fixing the espresso machine because maintenance uses the freight?" "No," he said, shifting the envelope to his armpit so he could pocket the sippy cup. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She looked at the kid who was now opening one droopy eye, staring at Evelyn's diamond stud earrings. "You're a delivery driver. Hand me the envelope. I'll make sure it gets to whoever ordered whatever subpar breakfast you're carrying." "It's not breakfast," he said softly. The elevator engaged the sudden G-force, pressing them into the floor as it rocketed upward. "My name is Caleb. I'm guessing you're Evelyn. You look like your Forbes picture, just stiffer." Her fingers curled into fists inside her coat pockets. The sheer audacity of a civilian in her metal box was grating enough, but him knowing her name made the hair on her arms prickle. He wasn't a courier. Couriers didn't make eye contact. But he couldn't be a shareholder. She knew every major player in this city. They smelled like sandalwood and tax evasion, not baby wipes. "Whatever stunt you think you're pulling," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a whisper that usually made grown men sweat. "It ends when these doors open. My security team will escort you and your luggage out of my building." Caleb sighed. It was a long, ragged sound. "It's not a stunt, Evelyn. And her name is Ilara. Please don't call her luggage. She understands more than you think." The elevator chimed. Floor 82. The doors parted to reveal the antechamber of the boardroom. The carpeting here was so thick it absorbed all sound, rendering footsteps mute. A massive mahogany table anchored the glass-walled room beyond. Around it sat 9 men and 2 women, the collective net worth of a small European country. They were drinking sparkling water out of crystal glasses, murmuring in the low, aggressive tones of predators deciding how to split a carcass. Evelyn stepped out. The AC was cranked low, a deliberate tactic she used to keep people awake and slightly uncomfortable. She immediately caught the eye of Richard, her general counsel. He gave a subtle nod. The paperwork was ready. "Evelyn," Gregory, the chief financial officer, called out. "We're just going over the final valuation. The underwriters are on standby." She didn't answer right away. She turned, expecting the man Caleb to have scurried back down the elevator. Instead, he was right behind her. Ilara was awake now, squirming to be put down. Caleb set her on the thick carpet. She immediately toddled toward a modern art sculpture in the corner, her light-up sneakers flashing violently against the muted decor. "Get him out of here," Evelyn barked at the 2 security guards stationed by the double-glass doors. The guards stepped forward, broad-shouldered, and wearing earpieces. "Sir, you need to come with us." Caleb ignored them. He walked past Evelyn, his boots leaving faint indentations in the plush carpet. He stopped at the head of the boardroom table. The murmuring died. 11 heads turned their expressions, morphing from annoyance to sheer bewilderment. "Who let a vagrant onto the executive floor?" Richard demanded, standing up his chair, scraping loudly against the floorboards beneath the rug. "Evelyn, what is this?" "He followed me onto the elevator," Evelyn said, striding into the room. She felt a bead of sweat roll down her spine, a highly irregular sensation. She hated feeling out of control. "Security is handling it." One of the guards placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. Caleb didn't flinch, but he didn't move either. He looked at the hand, then back at the guard. "If you touch me again, I'll have your firm's contract terminated before lunch. Let go." The guard hesitated, looking at Evelyn. Evelyn let out a derisive snort. "Oh, he's delusional. Throw him out. Gently so we don't have a lawsuit on our hands." "Dad!" The little girl's voice piped up. She was holding a piece of the art installation, a supposedly immovable brass sphere. She had somehow unscrewed it. "Put that down, Bug," Caleb said, his voice instantly softening. He looked at the board. The heavy silence in the room was palpable, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and the faint squeak of a dry erase marker someone had dropped. "My name is Caleb Foster," he said, tossing the battered manila envelope onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a dull, heavy thwack, sliding a few inches, before coming to rest against a crystal water pitcher. "I'm the executor of the Harrison estate, and as of midnight last night, the primary majority shareholder of Apex Holdings." A collective scoff rippled through the room. Gregory laughed aloud, a barking sound. Evelyn felt a sharp pain in her palm. She had dug her fingernails into her own skin. The Harrison estate was liquidated 3 years ago, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with condescension. She walked to the table, not bothering to look at the envelope. Old man Harrison died with no heirs. His shares were absorbed into a blind trust managed by... She trailed off, her brain hitting a snag. Managed by an LLC out of Delaware. Caleb finished for her. He pulled a chair out Evelyn's chair, the one at the head of the table, and sat down. He slouched, resting his elbows on the polished wood. A blind trust that was waiting for probate to clear on his unlisted biological grandson, which took 3 years, and a lot of DNA tests. Evelyn stared at him. The smell of cheap coffee and damp wool was invading the room, overpowering the scent of expensive leather and dry cleaning chemicals. She looked at Richard. Richard was already reaching for the envelope. His hands, usually so steady when drafting ruthless severance packages, had a slight tremor. He pulled the red string, unwinding it from the cardboard clasp. "This is a joke," Evelyn said. But her voice lacked its usual bite. The room suddenly felt too bright, the fluorescent lighting buzzing slightly, in a way she had never noticed before. Caleb pulled the plastic sippy cup from his pocket and set it on the table. Condensation instantly began to pool on the expensive wood, threatening to leave a water ring. "It's not a joke. Old man Harrison hated this company. He hated what he built. He left it to my mum, who didn't want it, and then she died, so it went to me. I'm a mechanic. I don't know anything about equity firms." "Clearly," Evelyn snapped. "You look like you fix transmissions in a driveway." "I do," Caleb agreed amiably. "But I know enough to know you're about to sell off the IP of 3 companies you hostilely took over, putting about 4,000 people out of work by next quarter to boost your IPO valuation." Evelyn's stomach dropped. Those numbers were internal. Not even the underwriters had the full casualty list yet. She looked back at Richard. Richard was reading the documents. He had pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket. The silence stretched. The only sound was the rustle of the thick, legal-grade paper and the soft tap-tap of Ilara hitting the brass sphere against the leg of a chair. "Richard," Evelyn said, the word coming out tighter than intended. "Tell him he's trespassing." Richard didn't look up. He flipped a page, then another. He licked his lips. The dry, papery sound echoed in the quiet room. He flipped to the back, looking at the notary stamps, the seals, the signatures. Evelyn watched a drop of sweat form on Richard's brow, catch the light and slide down his temple. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy, as if the atmospheric pressure had dropped, signaling a storm. "Evelyn," Richard whispered. He took his glasses off. He didn't look at Caleb. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes wide and hollow. "The seals are from the Delaware Chancery Court. The watermarks are authentic. The custodial chain of the blind trust." He swallowed hard. "He owns 51%. Unrestricted voting shares." Someone down the table let out a low curse. Gregory dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. Evelyn couldn't breathe. The carefully constructed architecture of her reality was buckling. She looked at Caleb. He was leaning back in her chair, watching his daughter play. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't have the smug, greasy smile of a corporate raider who had just checkmated a rival. He just looked tired. "That's impossible," Evelyn said. Her voice was barely a rasp. She walked over, leaning over Richard to look at the papers. The black ink swam before her eyes. Legalese, statutes, clauses. But there at the bottom, unmistakable, was the transfer of the controlling block of Apex Holdings to Caleb Foster. "I laughed when you told me you were here for the board meeting." Evelyn said the words spilling out before she could stop them. Her chest felt tight, the silk lining of her blazer suddenly feeling like sandpaper against her skin. "I know," Caleb said. He picked up the sippy cup, wiping the condensation off the table with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. Evelyn winced at the friction of the rough fabric against the mahogany. People usually do. "You don't know how to run this company," she said, her volume rising. Panic, cold and sharp, was finally piercing her armor. "You're a mechanic. This is a $50 billion entity. We have international holdings. We have SEC regulators breathing down our necks. You can't just walk in here with a toddler and—" "I'm not going to run it," Caleb interrupted. He sat forward, resting his chin on his hands. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced, just for a second, by something incredibly sharp and uncompromising. "I don't care about your international holdings. I care about the 4,000 jobs you're cutting to make yourselves richer. So the merger is dead. You can't do that." Gregory stood up, his face purple. "We have legally binding LOIs with the buyers. If we pull out now, the penalty clauses will bankrupt the subsidiary branches." "I checked the bylaws on the way here," Caleb said, nodding to the envelope. "Page 42. The majority shareholder can veto any restructuring that poses a reputational hazard to the parent company. I'm declaring this a hazard. It's done. Call the underwriters. Tell them to go home." Evelyn stared at the ring of water the sippy cup had left on the table. A perfect, wet circle ruining the finish. She had spent 10 years clawing her way to the top of this firm. She had sacrificed her 20s, her sleep, her human connections, becoming a machine that generated profit. She had built an empire of glass and steel entirely insulated from the messy, chaotic world below. And now a man who smelled like spilled apple juice had walked in and dismantled it in 3 minutes. She felt a strange, bubbling sensation in her chest. For a terrifying second, she thought she was going to cry. But then, as she looked at Caleb, who was now trying to pry a piece of old chewing gum off the underside of the table so his kid wouldn't eat it, the absurdity of it all hit her. Evelyn let out a laugh. It wasn't the cynical bark from the elevator. It was a ragged, breathless sound tearing from her throat. It was the sound of a woman watching her house burn down and realizing she never liked the curtains anyway. The board members stared at her in horror. Evelyn braced her hands on the table, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into the wood. "You have no idea what you've just done, Caleb." "I stopped a bloodletting," he said simply. "You started a war." Evelyn counted her eyes, locking onto his. The panic was receding, replaced by a cold, familiar adrenaline. "The board will sue you for breach of fiduciary duty. They'll tie you up in litigation until your daughter is in college. You think you can just walk in here and play boss?" Caleb stood up. He walked over to Ilara, scooped her up and settled her back onto his hip. He looked at Evelyn, his expression perfectly calm. "I don't want to play boss, Evelyn," he said softly. But the board confirmed it. "I am your boss. Now I need to get her to preschool. We can talk about how you're going to fix this mess at 9 tomorrow." He turned and walked toward the glass doors, the little girl waving lazily over his shoulder. Evelyn stood in the deafening silence of the boardroom, the phantom taste of copper heavier than ever, realizing that for the first time in her life, she had absolutely no idea what to do next. Sleep refused to come. Evelyn lay on her back, staring at the shadow cast by the street lamp through her floor-to-ceiling windows. Her penthouse was a study in minimalist perfection, entirely devoid of personal artifacts, smelling faintly of the ozone generated by the high-end air purifiers. The silk sheets, usually a cool comfort against her skin, felt like a trap. She kicked them off. The sudden rush of air conditioning over her bare legs raised goosebumps. But she didn't pull the blanket back up. 14 hours had passed since the boardroom disaster. 14 hours of frantic phone calls, encrypted emails, and screaming matches with corporate litigators whose hourly rates could buy a small island. Evelyn swung her legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floor was freezing. She walked to the kitchen, a stainless steel monolith, and pressed the button on the espresso machine. It hummed, a low vibration she felt in her teeth. Her phone buzzed on the marble counter. It was 3 a.m. "Tell me you found a loophole," she said, answering without looking at the caller ID. She knew it was Cole, her lead external counsel. He was a man who lived on nicotine and spite, usually the smartest person in any room Evelyn wasn't currently occupying. "I have 5 paralegals who have been drinking Red Bull since noon." Cole's voice crackled through the speaker, raspy and thin. "There is no loophole. The old man's trust was ironclad. Whoever drafted it hated your guts and anticipated every possible legal challenge. We contest the DNA. They stall us in court for a decade while the company bleeds out. We challenge his mental fitness to act as executor. They countersue for defamation and demand an immediate audit of our restructuring plans." Evelyn closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. "He's a mechanic, Cole. He probably hasn't paid off his mortgage. Find his price. Everyone has a number where principals turn into a signature." "I pulled his financials," Cole said. The sound of a lighter flicking echoed over the line. "Clean. Boring. No massive debt, no gambling problem. He owns his shop outright. Lost his wife 4 years ago to an aneurysm. He's been raising the kid alone. He makes about 80 grand a year after taxes. Evelyn, guys like this, they don't know what to do with a $50 million buyout. It scares them. But I drafted a settlement agreement anyway. Non-voting shares a massive cash payout and a board seat that comes with a mute button." "Send it to my tablet," Evelyn said. The espresso machine spat out a thin stream of dark liquid. She took the cup, not bothering with milk or sugar, and drank it in 2 scalding gulps. The bitterness scraped down her throat. "I'm going to see him." "Bad idea," Cole warned. "Don't engage without legal present. You're too aggressive. You'll spook him." He walked into my boardroom smelling like baby vomit and derailed a billion-dollar merger. Evelyn snapped her voice, finally losing its icy composure. "He is not spooked by me. That's the problem. I need to see him in his environment. I need to know what I'm actually fighting." She hung up, dropping the phone onto the counter with a loud clatter. By 6 a.m. she was in the back of her town car, watching the slick, rain-washed streets of the financial district give way to the cracked asphalt and faded awnings of the industrial edge of the city. The sky was the color of bruised iron, spitting a fine, miserable mist. Her driver, a silent man named Thomas, pulled the heavy sedan to a stop next to a chain-link fence. Evelyn peered out the tinted window. A faded wooden sign hung precariously over an open garage door, Foster's Auto Repair. The building was cinder block, painted a peeling, seasick green. 2 rusted husks of sedans sat in the side lot weeds, growing through their missing engine blocks. She stepped out of the car. The smell hit her instantly, a heavy, suffocating mix of aerosol brake cleaner, scorched rubber and stale rain. Her pristine beige trench coat felt immediately absurd, a target painted on her back. She navigated a puddle, swirling with iridescent motor oil, her heels clicking aggressively against the uneven concrete. Inside the garage, the noise was deafening. An air compressor shrieked in the corner. Heavy rock music bled from a battered radio, coated in greasy dust. Caleb was under a car. All Evelyn could see were his legs clad in faded denim and a pair of scuffed steel-toed boots. He was sliding out on a creeper board, a wrench clenched in his oil-stained hand. He wore a grey t-shirt that clung to his chest, dark with sweat despite the morning chill. He wiped his forehead with the back of a wrist, leaving a smear of black grease across his brow. He didn't look surprised to see her. "You're early." Caleb said, tossing the wrench onto a metal workbench. It landed with a sharp clang. "The meeting isn't until 9. Evelyn didn't step further into the bay. She stood near the entrance, hyper-aware of the grime that seemed to float in the air, threatening to settle on her collar. "I prefer to handle my problems before breakfast." Caleb grabbed a blue shop towel, methodically wiping the grease from his fingers. He looked exhausted. The bruises under his eyes were darker today. "I'm not a problem, Evelyn. I'm just the guy holding the brakes." "You're holding a hostage," she corrected her voice, cutting through the hum of the compressor. She reached into her leather tote and pulled out the thick ivory envelope Cole had prepared. She walked over to an overturned plastic bucket and set the envelope on top of it. $50 million. Post-tax. Direct deposit into whatever local credit union you use. In exchange, you sign over your voting rights to me as proxy and you walk away. Caleb stopped wiping his hands. He looked at the envelope, then up at Evelyn. His expression was utterly unreadable. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the dripping of water from a leaky gutter outside. Evelyn watched his jaw work. She knew this script. She had run it 100 times with stubborn startup founders and arrogant tech bros. They always stared at the number, their righteous indignation melting into greed. Caleb walked over to the bucket. He didn't touch the envelope. Instead, he reached past it to grab a half-empty bottle of water. He unscrewed the cap and drank his Adam's apple bobbing. $50 million, he said, wiping his mouth. That's a lot of transmissions. It's generational wealth, Evelyn said, keeping her tone flat, factual. It's a private school for Ilara. It's a house in a neighborhood where you don't have bars on the windows. It's security. And all you have to do is let me do my job. Caleb sighed. He leaned against the fender of the car he'd been working on. Your job is gutting 3 companies and firing 4,000 people. People who have mortgages, car payments, kids. You slice them off a spreadsheet to make a stock price jump 3 points. It's corporate efficiency. Evelyn countered, feeling a spike of genuine irritation. Those companies are bloated. They are failing. We bought them to salvage the IP. If we don't restructure, they go bankrupt in 2 years anyway, and everyone loses their jobs. I'm excising the rot to save the core. I read the quarterly reports, Caleb said quietly. Evelyn paused, a frown pulling at the corners of her mouth. You read the financials. I stayed up all night reading them, he corrected. I don't understand all the acronyms, but I understand math. The manufacturing plant in Ohio. The one you're closing, it's turning a profit. A small one, but it's in the black. You're closing it because the land it sits on is worth more to a commercial developer than the factory is worth to your portfolio. Evelyn felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. He wasn't supposed to know that. That was buried in a tertiary environmental impact report. Real estate valuation is a standard metric for asset liquidation. It's a town of 6,000 people. Caleb said, his voice hardening, the tired mechanic, suddenly vanishing, replaced by something much more dangerous. 2,000 of them work at that plant. You close it, the town dies. The diners close. The schools lose funding. The grocery store boards up. I am not a social worker, Mr. Foster. I am a CEO. My fiduciary duty is to the shareholders. I am the majority shareholder, Caleb said softly. He tapped his chest with a grease-stained finger. And I say the plant stays open. Evelyn stared at him. She felt completely untethered. He was immune to the money. He was immune to the intimidation. He was operating on a moral framework that had absolutely no place in high finance. It was infuriating. It was pathetic. And somewhere deep in the very back of her mind, it was terrifying. You are going to destroy my company, she whispered. It wasn't a threat. It was a realization. It's my company, Caleb corrected her. He picked up the ivory envelope and held it out to her. "Take your money, Evelyn. Go home, change your shoes. They look ridiculous in a chop shop. I'll see you at 9. Bring the restructuring plans. All of them." Evelyn didn't take the envelope. She turned on her heel, her shoe slipping slightly on the slick concrete. She caught her balance, her face burning with sudden humiliation. She walked back to her car without looking back, the damp chill of the morning seeping through her expensive coat, settling deep into her bones. She got into the back seat, slamming the door. Thomas looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Back to the office, Miss Thorne?" he asked. "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with an anger she hadn't felt in a decade. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. "Call Gregory. Tell him to pull the Ohio files. All of them." The boardroom at 9 a.m. smelled entirely different than it had the day before. The scent of fear had replaced the scent of arrogance. Evelyn sat at the head of the table. She had changed into a charcoal suit, her armor perfectly tailored, devoid of any weakness. The board members were already seated, their laptops open, their faces pale. Gregory was sweating profusely, dabbing at his upper lip with a linen handkerchief. At exactly 9 o'clock, the glass doors opened. Caleb walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark jeans, a clean white button-down shirt that looked suspiciously like it had been bought in a 3-pack from a discount store, and a plain black blazer that didn't quite fit his shoulders. He didn't bring a Lara this time. He carried a battered canvas messenger bag. He didn't walk to the head of the table. Instead, he pulled out a chair halfway down the side, sandwiched between the vice president of marketing and the head of logistics. The two executives shifted uncomfortably, pulling their elbows in. Caleb unzipped his bag and pulled out a stack of printouts. They were dog-eared, highlighted in neon yellow, and covered in messy handwritten notes. "Good morning," Caleb said. He looked around the table. Nobody spoke. They all looked at Evelyn. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Foster, we have the revised merger documents. As requested, we have halted the IPO proceedings. We are currently hemorrhaging roughly $400,000 an hour in lost momentum and penalty fees." "We'll survive," Caleb said dismissively. He flipped open his stack of papers. "Let's talk about the logistics network you're trying to sell to a third-party vendor." Gregory cleared his throat, leaning forward. "Mr. Foster, the outsourcing of our trucking division will reduce operational overhead by 22%. It is a standard efficiency play. We offload the vehicle maintenance, the insurance liabilities, and the union negotiations. And the drivers take a 40% pay cut under the new vendor," Caleb replied, not looking up from his notes. "And lose their pensions. Market rates dictate compensation," Gregory said, his voice taking on a patronizing edge. "We cannot carry dead weight simply out of nostalgia for the working class." Caleb stopped flipping pages. He looked at Gregory. The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. "Dead weight. These guys drive 70 hours a week, hauling your servers across the country in blizzards. I read the accident reports. You had 3 drivers hospitalized last year because you refused to authorize winter tire upgrades to save a few grand." Gregory bristled. "That is an oversimplification of a complex procurement issue." "It's cheap," Caleb interrupted. "It's cheap and it's cowardly. You don't want to deal with the mess of actual human beings, so you sell them off to a shell company that will grind them into dust, and you call it an efficiency play." "Mr. Foster," Evelyn said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a wire. "If we do not outsource the logistics, our operating margins fall below the threshold required by our primary lenders. They will call in our debts. We will default. If you care so much about these drivers, you should understand that if the parent company defaults, everyone loses their jobs. Not just the drivers. Everyone." She stared at him, daring him to argue with the math. Caleb looked at her. He didn't look angry. He looked tired again, but there was a sharp intelligence in his eyes that Evelyn was beginning to hate. "I know," Caleb said softly. "I saw the debt covenants." Gregory let out a quiet, scoffing breath. "Then you understand why we have to proceed." "No," Caleb said. He reached into his bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the mahogany table toward Evelyn. "I understand why you have to find the money. I just disagree on where you're taking it from." Evelyn picked up the paper. It was a breakdown of executive compensation. "I don't need $50 million, Evelyn," Caleb said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "But it looks like a lot of people in this room do. The C-suite bonuses scheduled for this quarter contingent on the merger total roughly $85 million. Add in the stock options and the golden parachutes for the executives you're pushing out of the acquired firms, and you're looking at over $120 million. Evelyn felt her pulse hammer in her throat. She looked at the paper. It was accurate. "You're not cutting the trucking division," Caleb said, leaning back in his chair. "And you're not closing the Ohio plant. You're going to fund the operational shortfall by canceling every single executive bonus for the next 4 quarters. The boardroom erupted. Chairs scraped. Men stood up, shouting. Gregory slammed his hand on the table. "You can't do that. Those bonuses are contracted. We will sue you into oblivion. You are destroying shareholder value." "I am the shareholder," Caleb roared. The shout was so loud, so raw, that it shocked the room into absolute silence. The executives froze, staring at the mechanic in the cheap blazer. Caleb took a deep breath, his chest heaving slightly. He lowered his voice, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "I own 51%. I decide what has value. And right now, the people who actually build your products, drive your trucks, and keep this company breathing have value. You people just siphon it." He looked directly at Evelyn. The animosity in the room was suffocating a thick, toxic cloud. But as Evelyn met his gaze, she didn't feel the blind rage she had felt in the garage. She felt a strange, cold clarity. He was right about the debt covenants. He was right about the bonuses. He was legally bulletproof, and he was utterly willing to burn his own house down to prove a point. Gregory leaned over to Evelyn, his face red spit flying from his lips. "Evelyn, do something, invoke the poison pill. Call a vote of no confidence. We cannot let this blue-collar terrorist dictate our compensation." Evelyn looked at the sheet of paper in her hand. She looked at the screaming executives, the men she had worked alongside for years, men who would sell their own mothers for a fractional share increase. Then she looked at Caleb, who was sitting quietly amid the chaos waiting for her move. She realized with a sickening jolt that she was standing on a fault line. Evelyn slowly stood up. The room instantly quieted, everyone waiting for the CEO to unleash her legendary wrath, to verbally eviscerate the mechanic and restore order to their universe. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany table. "Gregory." Evelyn said, her voice perfectly calm, entirely devoid of emotion. "Call HR. Draft the memo. Cancel the bonuses." Gregory's jaw dropped. "Evelyn, what?" "You heard me," she said, not taking her eyes off Caleb. "The bonuses are cancelled. We are retaining the logistics division. We will find the margin elsewhere." Caleb's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. It was the first time she had surprised him. A tiny microscopic crack in his armor. Evelyn didn't smile. She just held his gaze, letting him see the cold, calculating machine humming beneath her ribs. He thought he had won a moral victory. He didn't understand that he had just forced her to change the rules of the game. "Meeting adjourned," Evelyn said, turning her back on the stunned room. She had lost the battle. But as she walked out of the boardroom, the taste of copper fading from her tongue, Evelyn decided she was absolutely going to win the war. Silence in the executive suite possessed a new suffocating weight. It wasn't the hushed reverence of a well-oiled machine humming with profit. It was the tense, breathless quiet of a mutiny waiting to breach the doors. Evelyn pressed 2 manicured fingertips against her temples, trying to massage away a headache that felt like a hot copper wire strung directly behind her eyes. Coffee tasted like ash today. Evelyn pushed the porcelain cup across her pristine glass desk, the ceramic grating loudly against the surface. For 48 hours she had been entirely cut off. Her emails to department heads bounced back with automated out-of-office replies. Her phone lines to the legal department went to voicemail. Gregory had mobilized the C-suite in a silent, coordinated strike. They were bleeding the company to force her hand, betting that the board would fire her for gross mismanagement before the quarterly earnings call next Tuesday. She pulled up the livestock ticker on her monitor. Apex Holdings was down 4% since the opening bell. The market smelled blood. A sharp knock broke the sterile silence. Her assistant, a usually unflappable young man named Toby, stepped into the doorway. His collar was slightly askew, a glaring anomaly in the Apex ecosystem. "Evelyn," Toby said, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "Gregory just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He bypassed your calendar. He's filed a motion for a vote of no confidence." Evelyn didn't blink. She felt the familiar icy rush of adrenaline flood her veins, sharpening the world into high-definition focus. "On what grounds?" "Breach of fiduciary duty," Toby replied, swallowing hard. "He's citing the cancelled bonuses and your refusal to proceed with the logistics outsourcing. He leaked a memo to the Journal." "Show me," she demanded. Toby hurried forward, placing an iPad on her desk. The screen displayed a draft article from a major financial news outlet. The headline was a gut punch: "Apex Holdings Paralysis, Rogue CEO, and Blue-Collar Air Tank Billion-Dollar Merger." The article painted Caleb as an unhinged grieving mechanic who had inherited a financial empire by clerical error, and Evelyn as a desperate executive capitulating to his delusions to save her own skin. It was a masterpiece of corporate assassination. Gregory had handed the street a narrative that made them both look entirely incompetent. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," Evelyn said, sliding the iPad back. "You don't have any," Toby pointed out miserably. "Everyone cancelled on you." "Then get my car out front." Rain lashed against the windshield of her sedan as Thomas drove her out of the financial district. The city transformed from towering glass obelisks into sprawling squat warehouses of corrugated steel and faded brick. Evelyn rolled down the window just a crack. The air rushing in smelled of wet concrete diesel exhaust and cold rain. It was a harsh, bitter smell, entirely devoid of the filtered nothingness she was used to. Caleb's shop was closed. The rolling steel doors were pulled down and locked, but a dim, flickering fluorescent light spilled from a side office window. Evelyn stepped out of the car, popping a black umbrella. She bypassed the puddles of iridescent oil with practiced precision and knocked hard on the metal door. A minute passed. She knocked again, louder, the sound echoing dully in the damp alleyway. The door groaned open. Caleb stood there, wiping his hands on a greasy red shop rack. He wore a faded grey thermal shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark, curling hair on his chest. He looked at her umbrella, her tailored charcoal trench coat, and her expression of barely concealed murder. "You look like a funeral director," Caleb said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Gregory is going to kill your company tomorrow at 9 a.m. Evelyn said, not waiting for an invitation to step inside. She pushed past him into the cramped office. It was a claustrophobic nightmare of organized chaos. The walls were covered in faded calendars featuring classic muscle cars. A battered metal desk was buried under stacks of invoices, fan belts, and a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers. The air was thick with the scent of old rubber and stale coffee. In the corner, nestled in a makeshift bed of clean, moving blankets, Ilara was fast asleep, a plastic dinosaur clutched in her small fist. Evelyn lowered her voice instantly, a reflex she didn't know she possessed. He's called a vote of no confidence. He leaked a smear campaign to the press. By tomorrow afternoon, the stock will crater, the lenders will panic, and they will trigger the debt covenants. Apex will go into receivership, the board will strip the assets to pay off the debt, and your beloved Ohio plant will be sold for scrap metal by Friday. Caleb closed the heavy metal door. The sound of the rain was instantly muted. He tossed the red rag onto the desk and leaned against a filing cabinet, crossing his arms. "I have 51% of the vote," he said quietly. "I'll just vote no." "You don't understand how this works," Evelyn hissed, stepping closer to him. She could smell the soap on his skin, beneath the layer of engine grease. "They are declaring you mentally unfit to execute the trust. Gregory has undoubtedly bought off a judge to place your shares in temporary escrow, pending a psychological evaluation. It's a standard hostile freeze-out. While your shares are locked, my vote is irrelevant. They will fire me, install Gregory as interim CEO, and execute the layoffs before you can even hire a lawyer." Caleb's jaw tightened. The easygoing mechanic vanished, replaced by the man who had terrified a room full of billionaires simply by sitting in a chair. He looked at Evelyn, his dark eyes searching hers. "So why are you here?" he asked softly. "If it's already over, why are you standing in a damp garage in shoes that cost more than my mortgage?" Evelyn felt a tremor in her hands. She clenched them into fists inside her coat pockets. "Because I don't lose. And I refuse to let a parasitic middle manager like Gregory dismantle my empire just because you decided to grow a conscience. It's not your empire anymore, Evelyn. It is if I save it." She countered the raw, ugly truth slipping out. She hated this vulnerability. She hated the grime under her fingernails from leaning on his desk. "I know how to stop them. But I can't do it with legal maneuvers. We need a fundamental shift in the operational reality. We need to make the company too valuable to liquidate." Caleb sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked incredibly old in the harsh, fluorescent light. "I'm listening." Evelyn pulled a folded topographical map and a thick blue folder from her coat. She spread them out over the greasy invoices on his desk, uncaring that the expensive paper instantly stained. "The Ohio plant," Evelyn said, pointing a sharp fingernail at a red circle on the map. "Gregory wants to sell it to commercial developers because the land is zoned for luxury residential, but it's also sitting on one of the largest subterranean geothermal reservoirs in the state. I buried the geological survey 3 years ago because the retrofit cost to convert the plant to green energy was too high, and the tax incentives weren't there." Caleb leaned over the desk, his shoulder brushing hers. He smelled like sweat and iron. "And now, the new federal infrastructure bill offers a $200 million grant for industrial geothermal conversion. If we secure that grant, the plant's valuation quadruples. The lenders won't trigger the covenants because the asset-to-debt ratio will shift massively in our favor. Gregory's entire argument that the plant is a liability vanishes." "So apply for the grant," Caleb said. "The deadline was yesterday." Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a grim whisper. "We need a retroactive extension. The only way the Department of Energy grants those is if the conversion is backed by a joint labor management initiative. We need the manufacturing union to sign a binding agreement pledging to provide the skilled labor for the retrofit." Caleb looked at her, a slow, cynical smile spreading across his face. It didn't reach his eyes. "You want me to talk to the union?" "I need you to get them in a room," Evelyn corrected. "I will talk to them. Evelyn, you tried to fire all of them 4 days ago. If you walk into a room with the union brass, they won't sign an agreement. They'll lynch you with a fan belt. Then you better make sure they listen, she said, her voice turning to ice. Because if they don't sign by sunrise, they are all unemployed. Set the meeting. Midnight in a 24-hour diner smells exactly like regret. The air was saturated with the heavy odor of frying grease, burnt hash browns, and industrial bleach. Evelyn sat in a cracked red vinyl booth, her cashmere coat draped over the back, feeling the springs of the seat digging into her thigh. Across from her sat Harlan. He was the head of the Ohio Manufacturing Union, a man built like a cinder block wall, possessing a beard that looked like steel wool and hands that could crush a brick. Next to him were 3 other union stewards, their faces hardened masks of suspicion and fatigue. Caleb sat next to Evelyn. He had changed into a clean flannel shirt, but he still looked like he belonged on their side of the table. Evelyn felt like an alien species. Let me get this straight. Harlan rumbled his voice like rocks tumbling in a dryer. He didn't touch the coffee the waitress had poured him. He stared a hole directly through Evelyn's forehead. The woman who drafted a white paper titled Acceptable Human Capital Attrition in Rust Belt Acquisitions wants us to sign a pledge to retrofit a plant she was going to bulldoze on Monday. That is correct, Evelyn said. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She met Harlan's glare with absolute, unwavering eye contact. Why should we trust a single word that comes out of your mouth, lady? One of the stewards spat a wiry woman with grease permanently etched into the lines of her face. You're a suit. You lie for a living. I don't lie, Evelyn stated, her voice cutting through the clatter of silverware from the kitchen. I optimize. Last week, optimizing meant liquidating your jobs to appease the market. This week, the market is trying to liquidate me. So optimizing means keeping your jobs to secure a federal grant that will save my company. Harlan let out a low, humorless chuckle. At least she's honest about being a shark. I am offering you a 5-year contract guarantee, Evelyn said, sliding the blue folder across the sticky formica table. No layoffs, a 10% wage increase funded by the federal grant. In exchange, your guys do the heavy lifting to tear out the old combustion turbines and install the geothermal loops. You get job security. I get a $200 million asset on my balance sheet. Harlan picked up the folder. His massive thumb flipped through the pages. The diner was quiet, except for the sizzle of the grill and the rhythmic dripping of a leaky coffee percolator. What happens if we say no? Harlan asked, looking up. What happens if we let you burn? Then I walk out of here, I draft a golden parachute for myself, and I leave you to Gregory. Evelyn said, leaning forward, resting her forearms on the table. Gregory doesn't care about optimization. He only cares about short-term stock bumps. He will lock the gates of that plant on Friday. He will tie up your pensions in bankruptcy court for a decade. You will lose your homes. You will lose your trucks. And in 5 years, the town you live in will be a ghost town. She let the words hang in the heavy, grease-filled air. It was a brutal picture, painted without an ounce of sympathy. It was exactly what they needed to hear. They didn't need a savior. They needed a mercenary who aligned with their interests. Harlan stared at her for a long time. Then he looked at Caleb. She always this cold-blooded Foster? Harlan asked. Usually colder, Caleb said quietly. But she's right. The board is coming for the throat. We need the signature Harlan. Harlan grunted. He reached into his flannel pocket, pulled out a chewed-up blue pen, and scrawled his massive signature across the bottom of the federal application. He tossed the folder back across the table. It slid into Evelyn's empty coffee cup with a loud clatter. You screw us on this, Evelyn, Harlan said, his voice a low, vibrating threat. And I won't need a lawyer to settle the dispute. Understood, Evelyn said. She took the folder, holding it like a shield. They walked out of the diner into the freezing rain. Evelyn pulled her coat tight against the chill. She felt a strange, exhausting, hollow sensation in her chest. She had just weaponized her own ruthless reputation to save 3,000 blue-collar jobs. The contradiction was making her nauseous. Caleb walked beside her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. That was terrifying, he admitted. That was business, Evelyn corrected automatically. Suddenly her phone vibrated violently in her pocket. It was Toby. She answered it, holding the phone to her ear as the wind whipped her hair across her face. Evelyn! Toby's voice was frantic, bordering on hysterical. Gregory just accelerated the timeline. He didn't wait for the morning. He convened an emergency late-night session via teleconference. They just voted. They locked Caleb's shares in escrow. Evelyn stopped walking. The pavement beneath her boots felt like it was crumbling. How? He found a judge in Delaware who owes him a favor. Toby gasped. Signed an emergency injunction, citing Caleb's lack of financial history and the sudden cancellation of the merger as proof of reckless endangerment of shareholder value. Evelyn, they just formally requested your resignation. If you don't step down by dawn, they are terminating you with cause. You lose everything. The severance, the stock options, all of it. The phone line went dead. Evelyn stood in the rain, the neon sign of the diner buzzing angrily above her. She looked at Caleb. The water was running down his face, soaking his shirt. What happened? Caleb asked, stepping closer. Evelyn tasted copper, the metallic tang of total defeat. Gregory won. Your shares are frozen. I'm fired. Caleb didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just stared at the wet asphalt for a long moment. Then he looked up at the towering skyscrapers of the financial district, hidden in the low-hanging storm clouds. My dad used to say that when a bolt is stripped, you don't try to unscrew it. Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly calm. You take an angle grinder and you cut the whole damn thing off. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes burning with a dark, unfamiliar intensity. You know where all the bodies are buried at Apex, right? I buried half of them myself, Evelyn whispered. Good, Caleb said. Let's go dig them up. The boardroom of Apex Holdings at 6 a.m. felt like a tomb. The heavy mahogany table was entirely cleared of the usual crystal water pitchers and legal pads. Gregory sat at the head of the table, Evelyn's chair looking smug, exhausted, and incredibly dangerous. The rest of the board members were present, either in person or via glowing screens mounted on the walls. The air was sterile, cold, and smelled of expensive cologne and fear. When the double-glass doors shattered, the silence swinging open with violent force, Gregory didn't even flinch. He just smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. Evelyn walked in. She was completely soaked. Her trench coat dripped rainwater onto the plush carpet. Her hair, usually sprayed into an immovable helmet, hung in damp strands around her face. She looked like she had been dragged through hell, but her posture was razor straight. Caleb flanked her, carrying a heavy cardboard banker's box. He dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table with a thunderous crash that made two executives physically jump. You are trespassing, Evelyn, Gregory said smoothly, leaning back in the leather chair. Security is already on their way up. Your keycard was deactivated an hour ago. Call them off, Evelyn said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. Or the next people walking through that door will be federal marshals. Gregory's smile faltered just a fraction of a millimeter. Empty threats from a terminated employee. Mr. Foster, your shares are currently in legal limbo. You have no voice here. I don't need a voice, Caleb said, stepping back from the box. I brought the receipts. Evelyn walked to the head of the table. She didn't wait for Gregory to move. She leaned over him, planting her wet hands on the armrests of his chair, trapping him. You cited a breach of fiduciary duty to freeze his shares. Evelyn said, her voice a low, lethal purr. You claimed he was recklessly endangering shareholder value, but you forgot one tiny, insignificant detail about the Apex corporate bylaws, Gregory. Gregory swallowed. He tried to lean away from her, but the chair was pushed tight against the table. I know the bylaws better than you. Clearly not, Evelyn snapped. She reached into her wet coat and pulled out a stack of papers, slamming them onto Gregory's chest. Section 4, paragraph 9. The Morality and Conflict of Interest Clause. Any board member found actively betting against the company's market capitalization forfeits their voting rights and is subject to immediate uncompensated termination. Gregory went pale. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. That. You have no proof of anything. I have the offshore routing numbers, Evelyn said, pulling a document from the top of the banker's box. You shorted Apex stock 3 days ago through a shell company in the Caymans. You knew the merger cancellation would cause a dip, and you decided to profit off the panic before you ousted me. You didn't just breach fiduciary duty, Gregory. You committed federal market manipulation. A collective gasp echoed through the room. On the monitors, several board members began muttering frantically. That's a lie, Gregory choked out, but his hands were shaking violently as he stared at the routing numbers printed on the page. I have the IP logs linking the Cayman accounts to your private server, Evelyn continued, her voice rising, filling the room with absolute authority. I have the emails between you and the hedge fund managers. You tried to burn my company to the ground, to line your own pockets, and you used Caleb as the scapegoat. She stood up, stepping back, allowing the full weight of her trap to crush him. As of this exact second, Evelyn announced to the stunned room, Gregory's board seat is vacant due to gross criminal misconduct, which means the emergency injunction against Caleb's shares, filed by a terminated compromised board member, is legally void. She looked at Caleb. He didn't smile. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and signed a single sheet of paper, resting on top of the box. Proxy rights, Caleb said, sliding the paper across the table to Evelyn. Full unrestricted voting power over the 51%, effective immediately. Evelyn picked up the paper. The power returning to her hands felt like a physical electric shock. She looked around the table. The remaining executives were staring at her in abject terror. They knew the bloodletting was about to begin. Security is here, Toby whispered, appearing in the doorway with 3 large men in suits. Excellent, Evelyn said, her voice returning to its familiar icy cadence. She pointed a perfectly manicured trembling finger at Gregory. Escort this man off the premises. Do not let him touch a computer. Confiscate his phone. And Toby call Cole in legal. Tell him to prep the DOJ handover files. Gregory didn't fight. He looked utterly broken, a man who had stepped on a landmine he thought he had defused. The security guards hauled him up and marched him out of the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn took her seat at the head of the table. The leather was warm from Gregory, a disgusting sensation, but she ignored it. She looked at the remaining board members. The logistics division stays, Evelyn commanded, tapping the proxy paper. The Ohio plant is undergoing a $200 million geothermal retrofit, backed by the federal government and the manufacturing union. The executive bonuses remain cancelled until we clear the debt covenants. Nobody argued. Nobody breathed. Meeting adjourned, she said softly. They scrambled out of the room like rats, abandoning a sinking ship, leaving only Evelyn and Caleb in the massive, quiet space. The morning sun finally broke through the storm clouds outside, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany table. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. The headache was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She heard the soft scuff of Caleb's boots on the carpet. He walked over and poured a glass of water from the crystal pitcher, setting it on the table in front of her. "You're a terrifying human being, Evelyn," Caleb said. Evelyn opened her eyes. She picked up the glass. The water was ice cold. "You gave me the proxy. You knew what I was going to do." "I gave you the proxy with a legally binding addendum attached to the back of that sheet," Caleb said, pointing to the paper she still held. "Read it." Evelyn flipped the proxy agreement over. Scrawled in blue ink in Caleb's messy handwriting was a single sentence: "Proxy remains valid only as long as 0 layoffs occur in the manufacturing and logistics divisions without majority shareholder approval." She stared at the words. It was a leash, an iron-clad, indestructible leash wrapping around the neck of her cutthroat instincts. She looked up at Caleb. He wasn't the tired, grieving mechanic anymore. He was the boss, a silent, unmovable force that had fundamentally rewired the architecture of her life. "You're going back to the garage?" Evelyn asked, her voice surprisingly soft. "Yeah," Caleb said, slinging his canvas bag over his shoulder. "Someone has to fix the transmissions, but I'll be reading the quarterly reports, every single one of them." He turned and walked toward the glass doors. Evelyn sat alone in the boardroom. The smell of expensive leather and ozone was back, but beneath it, very faintly, she could still smell the rain, the rust and the gritty, unyielding reality that had just saved her life. She pulled her laptop open, her fingers hovering over the keys, ready to rebuild her empire. Not out of glass and air, but out of steel, sweat, and friction. Did Evelyn's ruthless tactics combined with Caleb's blue-collar grit create the ultimate corporate dream team? Or is this volatile partnership doomed to explode? Hit that like button if you loved this high-stakes showdown. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story where the underdogs rewrite the rules. Drop a comment below. Would you have kept the money or fought the board like Caleb Share? This video with anyone who loves a gritty tale of redemption, and we'll see you in the next gripping narrative.